Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to our channel, and thanks for logging on. Even by the standards of my job, there's some days when I show up to the office and think, this is going to be awesome. And today is one of those days. The ultimate pure play manual wind Patek Philippe chronographs of the modern era on the left, the Patek Philippe 5070P on the right, the living legend, the 5070P. These two pieces, the ultimate variants of their respective model lines and the run-out models. Let's compare a living legend to a modern upstart. Now, truth be told, these watches are separated by less than a decade in total production time, but they feel born of entirely different eras. And the 5170, despite being the newer of the two watches and the more common production-wise, is actually the less known of the two because the 5070P is such a legend. Now, the 5170 bowed at Baselworld 2017 as the final edition of the new for 2010 5170. The succeeding model, launched 2019, is the 5172. That's a 41mm. The 5070 is a 42, and the 5170P you see right here is a 39.4. So it's interesting because it's distinct from the two watches that succeed and precede it. On my 16cm circumference wrist, it's the most wearable of the three and the more wearable of the two in our test. My 16cm wrist easily accommodating the 39.4mm case, the 11mm thickness, and the delightful 47.2mm lug-to-lug measurement. It's an easy watch to wear, and it's also quite contemporary in its appearance. Despite the smaller size than its predecessor, it has the same 21mm lug spacing with a brilliant cut top Vesselton diamond right in between to remind you that this is a modern platinum Patek Philippe timepiece. You can see that the strap is a gloss black, large rectangular scale alligator leather, unbolstered, folded edge, monotone stitch, calfskin underside, pull tab spring bars on both sides so you can easily remove the strap, and the watches essentially feature identical single fold Calatrava Cross buckle deployant clasps. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that, just know that they have identical equipment in that respect. The dial of the 5170 is explosive. Well, the 5170P specifically. As you can see, the case band is slender, the lines are rather simple, and the bezel is considerably less nuanced and singly stepped than the multi-level staircase of the 5070. The 5070 is almost a pagoda. This is rather simple. This is a bezel, not a piece of visual artifice. And you'll note the dial itself has none of the visual artifice of the 5070, which is basically trying to disguise the disparity between movement size and case size. The 5170 features a movement size to suit and manufacture made, which is why we mostly focus on those extraordinary center features. There's a gradient sunburst that starts a dark blue at the center and fades to almost black at the periphery. There's a tachymeter, so you can time something over a standing kilometer or mile, and then you have those extraordinary applique baguette diamonds. This one is a carrot top. It features a lot of carrots on top. You'll also note that at center the hands are loomed, a key distinction between these two watches, and you'll note that the sub-registers are actually slightly below the plane of the cannon pinion. The hands at center, they're somewhat dropped on the dial. Now turn it all over and you can see that interesting things are happening on the case back. Unlike the 5070, which features a Lamagna based modified Bausch, this is a movement that is built in-house by Patek Philippe. Manual wind, 65-hour power reserve, 4 Hz beat rate, free-sprung gyro max balance, adjusted in 6 positions. You can see it features an overcoil hairspring. These watches have not gone over to silicon. Patek Philippe still considers a handmade Breguet overcoil to be its flagship offering, and that is why the watch has that. You can see that here the clutch is fully jeweled. The lateral clutch, you can watch it moving away from and into contact with the chronograph center wheel, and that's important because you can see that on the 5070, the CH2770 movement actually features a bushing on one of the wheels. The driving wheel has a bushing, the intermediate wheel has a jewel. So advantage in that respect, 29,535 PS, that's the movement you see here. Because it features the Patek Philippe seal, there is an attestation of precision no worse than -3 + 2 seconds per day. Both watches feature a capped column wheel, but the cap on the 29,535 is just a bit more beautiful than the screw and ring with the combination of satin and black polish that you see on the 5070. You also note the fast beating balance. A modern 4 Hz rate is much smaller. The watch does feature stop seconds, and it features a rack and pawl system. You can see that there is actually an instantaneous minute jumper, and oops, let's see it. There it is right there. An instantaneous minute jumper, a technical refinement that the 5070 does not have. The timepiece, being 1 millimeter thinner, is a little bit more discreet, a little bit slimmer and more elegant on the wrist. Both of these are dress watches, so as a dress watch, this one's perhaps a bit more adept. The movement is technically accomplished, beautifully finished, and in as much as there are far more pieces, it is a bit more satisfying to loop than the CH2770, which does feature the older Geneva hallmark. There's no disparity in finishing quality, there's simply more parts on the newer watch. Now jumping over to the 5070, this is a watch that was made, rather than the 2 model years of the 5170P, this was made for basically 1 model year spread out over 2 years total. So it was introduced in 2008, production came about mid-year, and by the end of the mid-season of 2009, so entering June, production was phased out. None of these were made with the Patek Philippe seal that bowed in mid-2009, and the best estimate is that somewhere between 180 and 200 of these were made. It is far less common than the 5170P. There were a couple of different versions of the 5070 over the years that were principally UK market themed limited runs, but for the most part of the big 4 precious metal models of the 5070, the P is by far the scarcest, as all the other golds, yellow, rose, and white, were built for several model years each. Now the watch on my wrist is big, 42 millimeters, introduced at Basel World 1998. The original yellow gold 5070 was a monster for its time. In diameter, it was the size of a Royal Oak offshore. 12 millimeters thick, it's not exceptionally girthy, and across the wrist, the lugs are nicely constrained. It's only 48.4. So a bit more than 1 millimeter larger. You can wear either of these watches if you can wear one. One of the prescient design elements of this watch was the large spacing between the lugs. 21 millimeters was huge back in 1998, and this is one of the design features of the timepiece that has held it in good stead over more than 20 years since the debut of the original design. This still looks contemporary. I'll also mention that though there is some visual gameplay to make the disparity between movement and case size less evident, the watch is for the most part not of modern design lineage, but it is a faithful reproduction of the 46mm Patek Philippe Museum reference 2512 split seconds prototype. This watch is a dead ringer for that one, so this watch is true to history rather than simply a piece of visual artifice. You can also see the pagoda-like triple step of the bezel, also designed to constrain the disparity visually between movement and case. Nevertheless, it winds up adding a lot more visual punch, so it has multiple purposes. I find it just makes the watch seem more imposing. On the case flank, both of the watches have Calatrava Cross style crowns with lozenge or rectangular pushers, both vintage inspired elements. You can see on the case back of this one, it is not quite as involved as the 29535 PS. Based on Lemania 2310 that as the Omega 321 went to the moon, this is an historic abouche that's been used by many great watches and great brands. You can see it is likewise a lateral clutch column wheel operation, slow beating, 18,000 vibrations per hour, free-sprung gyromax, adjusted in 6 positions and to hot and cold, Breguet overcoil hairspring, Ferris, of course. It features 24 jewels, and as you can see, the balance is almost 1/3 the diameter of the entire movement. Manual wind, 60-hour power reserve, and it is a beautiful old thing, nostalgic, stately, and it has a lovely, almost pocket watch-like cadence against the ear, and you can see the movement of the chronograph seconds hand jumping with its 5 hertz rate, or I should say 2.5 hertz, 5 beat per second rate. It really does seem like an old pocket watch chronograph on the wrist, and it's lovely for that. Let's talk about the advantages of these two pieces and which one you might rather have. Okay, let's start with the 5170. Again, it requires a little bit of a rundown, because how do you compete with a living legend? We'll start with the fact that if you buy one of these pre-owned, they're still available new, and you can still find them for their retail price of $96,400, but pre-owned for $87,000 to $90,000, you're going to pick one of these up for about half the entry-level price of a 5070P on the current market, so it's more affordable. It's also slimmer and more organic on the wrist. It blends in well as a dress watch should. It's more compact, it is more graceful. It doesn't have the studied brutality of the 5070. So on that basis, many will pick this watch. The movement is more sophisticated. It has a higher beat rate at 4 Hz versus 2.5. It has an extra 5 hours of power reserve. It has the instantaneous minute jumper. It has a stop seconds or hacking feature, so you can actually set the watch precisely. It is just just a more advanced movement in every technical respect. And I'll also mention that when you start the chronograph, there's actually a sprung interface between the driving wheel and the chronograph center wheel. So when you start the chronograph, there's not as much of a jump to it. You can see it's almost like a vertical clutch in that it doesn't have a ton of stagger as you start it up. Now, if you look at the 5070 and we do the same thing, you could see that there is a ton of gallop in this movement. In person, it's a bit more evident, but I would say the difference is about 1.5 seconds versus half a second of jump. Jumping back to the 5170, it's worth mentioning that this is a timepiece with a richer dial. Between the gradient blue fade of the dial and the applique diamond indices, it does feel like more energy, brain power, and money was spent here. And the fact that it doesn't have all of those surplus concentric scales means that there is an elegance to this dial that's lacking on the 5070. Again, better chronograph feel in addition to a more precise system that doesn't jump around quite as much. You could see that even as I actuate it, the system jumps less and it feels better. The tuning of the column wheel is just more crisp on the newer watch. And on that basis alone, I say this is a tactile pleasure that the 5070 is not quite. The 5070 is good, this is great. And I'll also mention that there's a proper sized movement on the case back. And the mark of a true manufacturer is to be able to build a movement that's sized and shaped for the watch. The 5170 does that on Patek's behalf, whereas the 5070 does not accomplish the like. Also, let's remember that this is a less contrived dial and a more elegant timepiece. Look at the thickness of the bezel. Look at the calibration of the dial. Look at the overall composition of the watch. It's more cohesive. Let's talk about the 5070. The 5070 is one of the few watches I can think of that inspires uncompromised awe from the guy who is the ultimate watch snob. He has a Philippe Dufour simplicity or even duality, a custom Carré-Voudelainen Masterpiece 2 chronograph. He has a piece unique Grubel Forsey and a whole portfolio of desirable vintage Rolex. He's in awe of this watch. He's not in awe of the 5170. Let's talk about wrist presence. It's not just that this is a 42mm watch, it's a 42mm watch with that remarkable pagoda-like stepped bezel that does add so much overall impact to the watch. It gives you an eyeful, and not in a way that wears on you. It's something that has a presence and a sculptural form, a rare instance of more actually being more. And you can see that it continues with concentric calibrations of the dial. I have no problem with this. To me, this is a wonderful survivor from a bygone era of Patek Philippe production and design, and I actually feel that on the wrist, this one looks twice as expensive and twice as impressive as the 5170. There's something about this watch, it's gravitas. The 5170 doesn't quite have as much as this one. I'll also mention that the timepiece has, even at current prices, status as a bona fide investment. I don't like to throw that word around with watches. I say money goes in the bank, watches go on the wrist, but this is a rare example of a watch you can buy at current prices, even at close to $200,000. Buy one of these today, it will never be worth less than you pay for it. And at the end of the day, I think you'll have more fun with it because it's a vintage Patek experience on a modern watch. And you can see that this one, like perhaps all 5070Ps, basically sat in a safety deposit box as it's never been refinished, and the sharp sculpted fluting of the lugs as well as the bezel is wonderfully intact, so it's a survivor on that basis. It doesn't have a loomed dial like the 5170 does, but the dial is lovely, and again, if you follow your Patek history, you're going to associate this immediately with the 2512, a legendary piece in its own right. Rarity. This is a watch made in somewhere between 180 and 200 pieces. I would estimate that's probably somewhere between 4 and 5 times as many 5170Ps in the world. Again, you can still buy them right out of cases. This watch had a wait list from the time it debuted on the market in 2008 at $87,500. It was never a watch you could find in a case. Today, at $180,000, $190,000, it's still the kind of watch that, frankly, never really shows up. I've never seen more than one of them in any place at a time. So you'll get the piece unique experience with this watch on your wrist. And at the end of the day, although it is a archaic movement, it is a much loved movement with a wonderful history. The history of the 321 that went to the moon, the long heritage of Patek Philippe's improved ébauche, and of course Lemagne's own formidable chronograph history dating back to the first quarter of the 20th century. And with the old school Patek Philippe seal blazoned on the half bridge, this is a lovely piece and one I have trouble not favoring over the 5170. At the end of the day, this is for me. Rarity, significance, presence, power, nostalgic look, and movement. I'm all about the 5070P, guys. Let me know in the box which of these two watches you prefer for your own wrist, because I made a narrow decision on behalf of the 5070. You might see it differently. Let me know. And if you own one of these watches, send me a wrist shot.